I want you to imagine, just for a moment, a world where the natural order is completely turned upside down.
Right, like totally inverted.
Yeah, exactly. Picture this. You wake up, you walk outside, and you realize that, well, horses are the rational, civilized masters of society.
Which is wild to even picture.
It is. I mean, they govern the towns, they hold these deep philosophical conversations, they practice agriculture, and human beings...
Right, where do we fit into this?
The humans are basically feral, naked, excrement-flinging beasts of burden.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're kept in kennels. They are driven entirely by base instincts, violence, and greed.
It is a profoundly jarring image to hold in your mind, honestly. It really strips away every single ounce of our, biological pride.
Oh, absolutely.
Because as a species, we like to categorize the world very neatly, don't we? We are the masters, we are the rational thinkers. Everything else is just an animal. It's a very comforting binary.
It is comforting. But then you step into the world of Jonathan Swift, and suddenly that comforting binary doesn't just crack, it shatters into a million pieces.
Completely shatters.
Today, we are hunting down the real Jonathan Swift. We're ripping away the sanitized children's cartoon version of Gulliver's Travels.
Right. The one everyone thinks they know.
Exactly. The one with the giant tied down by tiny people. Maybe you read a watered-down version in your high school literature class, but we are going to expose what is essentially a 300-year-old political revenge plot wrapped inside a philosophical horror story.
It really is a horror story when you dig into it.
Welcome to this deep dive into the source material. We're looking at the fourth and final book of Swift's masterpiece, A Voyage to the Country of the Houyhnhnms. I am so incredibly enthusiastic to unpack this with you today because, this book is merciless.
It is the absolute definition of a philosophical earthquake. And our mission today is to connect the dots between Swift's own 18th century political exile and the timeless, honestly terrifying questions he poses about whether humanity is truly fundamentally a rational species.
Which is a heavy question.
Very heavy. We're going to break down the historical events that fueled his bitter satire. We'll explore the massive shift he makes regarding human nature and uncover the heartbreaking emotional journey of our protagonist, Lemuel Gulliver.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even begin to understand these feral humans or these hyper-rational talking horses, we really have to look at the real-world political landscape that shaped Jonathan Swift's incredibly bitter pen.
Yeah, you can't separate the book from the politics.
Right, because reading through our sources, it becomes immediately obvious that this wasn't just, a fun fantasy story he dreamed up on a lazy Sunday. This was personal, wasn't it?
Oh, deeply, intensely personal.
Yeah.
To understand Swift's mindset, when he was writing this in the 1720s, we have to rewind about a decade to the period between 1710 and 1714. Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, during this time, Jonathan Swift wasn't just some witty clergyman in Ireland. He was actually living in London, acting as leading propagandist for the Tory ministry.
So the Tories were the ruling political party in England at the time.
Exactly. And he worked directly for the highest powers in the land. I'm talking Robert Harley, who was the Earl of Oxford, and Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke.
Okay, so if we were translating this to today, he was essentially the, chief communications officer for the prime minister?
That is a perfect analogy. He was at the absolute center of the political universe. He wrote incredibly influential pamphlets. One of his most famous was called The Conduct of the Allies.
And what was the goal of that one?
His goal with that specific piece of writing was to argue against the continuation of the War of the Spanish Succession. Swift and his Tory bosses, well, they saw this as a fundamentally corrupt war.
Corrupt how? Like, politically or financially? Both, really. They believed it was being prolonged solely to line the pockets of the rival political party, the Whigs, and their wealthy military contractors, people like the famous Duke of Marlborough.
Ah, I see.
So Swift is arguing for peace, but he's doing it as a ruthless, highly effective political operator.
Right, so Swift is at the absolute top of his game. He's rubbing elbows with the most powerful men in the British Empire. He's shaping national policy with his pen. But then the bottom just completely falls out. What exactly happened?
Well, the political machinery of the 18th century relied entirely on the monarch. And in 1714, Queen Anne died.
And that's a problem because she didn't have an heir, right?
Exactly. Because she died without a surviving heir, it triggered what's known as the Hanoverian succession.
Meaning they had to bring in a distant relative from Germany to be the king?
Yes. King George I comes over from Hanover to take the throne. But here's the catch. George deeply distrusted the Tories. He aligned himself entirely with the Whig party.
Oh, wow. So the rival party just gets handed the keys to the kingdom.
Basically, yeah. So overnight, there is this massive, overwhelming ascendancy of the Whigs. The Tory ministry completely collapses.
And when you say collapses, it wasn't just a normal, peaceful transfer of power, was it?
No, not at all. It wasn't just that they lost an election and became the opposition party. It was a catastrophe.
Ugh.
Bolingbroke, one of Swift's bosses, literally flees the country into exile in France to avoid being charged with treason.
Wait, treason?
Yeah, and the other boss, the Earl of Oxford, is literally sent to the Tower of London.
Wow. Okay, so his political allies are either in prison or on the run. Where does that leave Swift?
Well, Swift had been desperately hoping to be rewarded for his political service with a prestigious, comfortable bishopric in England.
Like a cushy retirement gig.
Right. Instead, he was essentially exiled. He was sent back to Ireland, given the position of Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, and basically told to stay out of the way.
That's brutal.
He viewed this as a total humiliating banishment, and honestly, he never fully reconciled himself to it.
It's kind of like a CEO crashing a massive company. The absolute most hated rival faction takes over the board of directors, and our guy Swift gets banished to manage a remote, failing branch office in another country while all his friends go to jail.
That's exactly how he felt.
You can just imagine the resentment simmering there. But who specifically is he mad at? Who actually takes over?
His resentment becomes laser-focused on the man who came to completely dominate this new era. And that was Robert Walpole.
Robert Walpole.
Yeah, Walpole became the Whig chief minister, which is what we would now call the first prime minister. And Walpole consolidated his power through what Swift and the Tories saw as the complete moral rot of public life.
Moral rot meaning corruption.
Oh, absolutely. Walpole was famous for using bribery, aggressive patronage, and the distribution of government offices and pensions just to hold a parliamentary majority together.
And it's wild how familiar this dynamic sounds even today. But just to be clear to you listening, we aren't picking sides between 18th century Whigs and Tories here.
No, definitely not.
We're just putting on Swift's incredibly biased, incredibly bitter glasses to see the world exactly as he saw it when he sat down to write this book. So, through Swift's glasses, what did this political divide actually look like?
Well, through Swift's glasses, this was a battle between two fundamental ideas of society: the country versus the court.
Country versus court. Okay, break that down.
Swift strongly favored the country ideal. This was the traditional Tory vision. They believed power should rest with the landed gentry people whose wealth was tied to the physical soil of the nation.
So farmers, but like very wealthy farmers.
Right, exactly. The aristocracy of the land. They wanted no standing army in peacetime, no massive national debt, and a government run by reasoned consensus.
And what about the court side?
Walpole, on the other hand, represented the court Whig reality. This was the new moneyed interest. It was all about financial speculation, processional politicians, stock markets, and a regime of funded national debt.
Oh, so basically Wall Street.
Pretty much. To Swift, it looked like the country was being sold out to slick financiers who produced nothing of actual value.
And I'm guessing there was a specific event that, at least in Swift's mind, proved him right. A moment where this new moneyed interest just blew up in everyone's faces.
There was. And it's one of the most important financial events in history. It's called the South Sea Bubble Crash of 1720.
Okay, I have heard of this, but break the mechanics of this down for me. How does a massive stock bubble in 1720 actually work?
Well, essentially, the British government had a massive amount of national debt from all those wars Swift had been arguing against. So the South Sea Company proposed a deal. They would take on the government's debt, and in exchange, the government would give them a monopoly on trade in the South Seas.
Which primarily meant South America, right?
Right. But here's the crazy part. The actual trade was practically non-existent. The company's real business was just manipulating its own stock price.
So it was a scam from the start.
Yes. They issued shares, they bribed politicians to promote the stock, and the price just skyrocketed. I mean, everyone from lords to maids was buying on margin, thinking they would get rich quick.
Wow. A classic pump and dump scheme, centuries before crypto was even a thing.
Exactly. And in 1720, the bubble burst. The stock price collapsed, wiping out massive fortunes across England. People lost everything. Suicide spiked. It was a total economic disaster.
That's horrifying. But where does Walpole fit into this?
This is where Robert Walpole really solidifies his power. He steps in to manage the crisis, but he does it by shielding the guilty politicians and company directors from facing any real consequences.
Wait, he protected the scammers.
He did. He managed the public outrage so effectively that he actually earned the sarcastic nickname the Screen Master General.
The Screen Master General. Wow, so Walpole is acting like a political fixer? Like a modern crisis manager hired not to save the victims, but specifically to make sure none of the executives go to prison.
Precisely. So picture Swift, sitting in his deanery in Dublin, watching the financial ruin of his country orchestrated by a corrupt class of professional politicians and stock jobbers who had literally ousted him and his friends.
Yeah, the rage must have been overwhelming.
It really was. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of Gulliver's Travels, Book 4 is deeply rooted in Swift's absolute disgust with his new establishment. In fact, later in the book, when Gulliver describes a chief minister of state to his horse master.
Oh, this is the part where he just roasts the prime minister?
Yes. He describes a man who rises by dissembling, governs through bribery, and surrounds himself with flatterers. Contemporary readers knew exactly who Swift was talking about. It was Robert Walpole, completely unmasked.
Okay, so Swift has this burning political rage, but he needs a delivery mechanism. I mean, he couldn't just write a pamphlet calling the prime minister a corrupt monster who caused a financial crisis, right? That would be libel, sedition, or worse.
Oh, he definitely would have been arrested.
So he chooses a disguise. And what a brilliant disguise it is. He decides to hijack the absolute most popular literary genre of his day, the travel narrative.
It was a masterstroke of tactical writing, truly. In the 1720s, the reading public was just absolutely obsessed with voyage literature.
Kind of like true crime podcasts today.
Exactly. Think about it. The globe was still being mapped. Books detailing exotic discoveries were massive bestsellers. So Swift specifically targets and parodies real contemporary travel books. Most notably, William Dampier's A New Voyage Round the World, which was published in 1697.
Right, but he doesn't just write a silly parody. He completely mimics the incredibly dry, factual tone of these books, doesn't he?
He adopts it perfectly. He uses the genre's self-important factuality as his shield. He includes these very solemn dates, exact nautical coordinates, and painfully boring lists of local flora and fauna.
So boring that you believe it's real.
Right, but he uses this hyper-realistic framework to achieve something literary scholars call defamiliarization.
Okay, that's a heavy academic term. How does defamiliarization actually work in practice?
So it's a concept first named by the Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky in 1917, though Swift was obviously doing it centuries earlier. The idea is that as human beings, we get so used to our everyday reality, our politics, our greed, our social structures, that we just stop actually seeing them.
We just accept them as normal.
Exactly. Defamiliarization is the technique of taking those familiar everyday things and presenting them in a bizarre, alien, or unfamiliar way. By making the familiar look strange, the author forces the reader to wake up and evaluate their own world with totally fresh eyes.
So Swift has this brilliant disguise, the fake travelogue. But a disguise is only as good as what it's hiding. By taking us to this fantasy island, he's actually setting a trap, isn't he? He's forcing us to look in a mirror at Europe.
Exactly. Hiding his philosophical and political critiques inside a fake travelogue essentially disarms the reader. You sit down thinking you are reading a whimsical adventure about a shipwrecked sailor, and suddenly you are hit with a devastating surgical critique of your own society.
Which brings up a really interesting mechanical question. How does Swift actually convince the reader of the 1720s to suspend their disbelief? I mean, he's using these bizarre tongue-twisting names like Houyhnhnm or Brobdingnag.
Right.
If you're trying to fake a factual report, why use names that look like you just smashed your hands on a keyboard?
What's fascinating here is how Swift manipulates the psychology of the 18th century reader. Since Gulliver claims to be discovering totally new, unmapped islands where no European has ever set foot, it was crucial to invent names that sounded entirely alien to English ears.
Did that make sense?
Think about it. If he had landed on an island of talking horses and said, oh, they call their land Nova Scotia or New London, readers would have instantly rejected it. The strange, almost unpronounceable, guttural names added a layer of faux authenticity. It made the fiction feel like a raw, untranslated factual report from a truly alien place.
It's the 18th century equivalent of deepfake authenticity. He makes it so weird that you assume it must be real. And he uses this vehicle to launch one of the most scathing critiques of European colonialism I've ever read, which happens toward the end of the book in chapter 12.
Yes, once the trap is completely sprung, Swift describes the standard European method of colonization with brutal, undeniable clarity. He strips away all the noble language of civilizing the savages and explains the raw mechanics of it.
What does he say?
He says a pirate crew gets blown off course and lands on a shore. They murder or enslave the native inhabitants. They plant a rotten board in the ground to claim possession in the name of a king who lives thousands of miles away. They arbitrarily rename the place.
Wow.
And then they return home to be hailed as heroes for founding a colony, as he puts it with dripping sarcasm, for the propagation of the gospel.
He exposes the absolute violence hiding underneath the rhetoric of empire. It's breathtakingly modern.
It is. And this anti-imperial stance draws heavily on what historians call the Black Legend.
What's a Black Legend?
These were the widely circulated accounts by figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, detailing the horrific atrocities committed by the Spanish against indigenous populations in the Americas.
Yeah, I see.
But because Swift is writing this, and because of where he is sitting when he writes it, it doubles as a very uncomfortable, implicit critique of England's rule over Ireland.
Right, because at this point, Swift wasn't just a defeated, exiled politician in Ireland. He had actually managed to reinvent himself as a massive national hero there, right?
He really had. Between 1724 and 1725, right around the time he was finishing Gulliver's Travels, Swift published a series of pamphlets called the Drapier's Letters.
Okay, tell me about these letters. Why did they make him a hero?
So the English government had granted a patent to an Englishman named William Wood to mint copper coins for Ireland. But the coins were severely debased, meaning they contained far less actual copper than their face value suggested.
So it was a scam.
It was essentially a scheme to siphon wealth out of the Irish economy and into English pockets. If the Irish were forced to use this junk currency, it would completely ruin local merchants.
And Swift stepped in to stop it.
Yes. Swift wrote the Drapier's Letters under the pseudonym of a humble draper, like a shopkeeper, arguing fiercely against the coins and calling for a massive boycott. His writing was so persuasive and the public uproar became so intense that the British government was literally forced to back down and withdraw the patent.
He literally defeated an economic extraction scheme with his pen. That is incredible.
He did. So when he criticizes the logic of conquest and the exploitation of a native population in Gulliver, the Irish subtext is totally unavoidable for his contemporary readers. He is drawing a straight, unbroken line from the piracy of the Americas to the economic and political domination happening right outside his cathedral doors in Dublin.
So we've got the political rage, we've got the genius disguise of the travel narrative, but when Gulliver actually steps off the boat onto this final island, what is the trap Swift has set for him and for us?
This is the turning point.
Yeah, this is where our deep dive really shifts from a political history lesson into a terrifying philosophical thought experiment. Gulliver lands, and the very first creatures he encounters are the Yahoos.
The Yahoos are perhaps the most viscerally horrifying creation in all of Swift's work. When Gulliver first sees them, he describes them purely as beasts. Physically, they are intensely repulsive.
Right, paint a picture for us.
They are covered in thick hair. They have long, sharp claws for climbing and tearing. They are fiercely aggressive, and they possess a deeply unpleasant defensive habit.
Which is?
When cornered or angry, they scramble up into the trees and discharge their excrement directly onto the heads of anyone standing below.
Ugh. And when Gulliver first sees them, he doesn't realize what they are, right? He just thinks they are some hideous local primate.
That's the crucial mechanism of Shklovsky's defamiliarization at work. Swift doesn't tell us they are human. He lets Gulliver be repulsed by them first purely as animals. But then Gulliver encounters the masters of the island, the rational horses.
The Houyhnhnms.
Yes. And the master horse, trying to figure out what Gulliver is, instructs a servant to bring one of these feral yahoos into the yard. He places Gulliver right next to the beast for a side-by-side comparison.
The ultimate horrifying mirror moment.
Exactly. Gulliver states that his horror and astonishment are not to be described. Because when he looks closely past the filth and the wild hair, he observes that in this abominable, excrement-flinging animal, there is a perfect human figure.
Oh, man.
The face is flat, the nose depressed, the skin is tanned and weathered, but the anatomy is undeniably biologically human.
He realizes he is looking in a funhouse mirror at his own species. And it's not just their bodies that horrify him, right? It's the realization that their disgusting behavior is just a raw, unfiltered version of human society. Because Yahoos have this obsession with these shining stones, don't they?
Yes, and this is where Swift directly connects his philosophical nightmare back to the South Sea bubble we discussed earlier.
Oh, this is a connection.
Yeah. The Yahoos will spend hours obsessively digging in the mud to hoard these specific shiny colored stones. But they have absolutely no practical use for them. They don't eat them. They don't use them to build shelter. They don't craft tools with them.
But they want them anyway.
Oh, they will fiercely fight to the death over them, and they hide them obsessively in their kennels, constantly terrified that another Yahoo will steal them.
It's human greed stripped of all its polite Wall Street terminology.
Precisely. The Yahoo's lust for these shining stones is entirely divorced from any real need or productive value. It is pure, destructive, irrational avarice. Swift is creating a literal, physical embodiment of the moneyed interest that he despised.
So, a society built on speculative hoarding, driven mad by the desire for something inherently worthless.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if we look at the intellectual climate of the 18th century, Swift isn't just making a point about stockbrokers. He is actively picking a fight with the leading philosophers of his day, isn't he?
Oh, he is launching a massive, scorched earth counterattack against the prevailing philosophical trends.
What were those trends?
Well, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, there were fierce debates about the fundamental nature of humanity. You had an ascendant school of optimistic philosophers epitomized by people like the Earl of Shaftesbury.
And what did Shaftesbury believe?
Shaftesbury argued for a belief in human innate goodness and natural benevolence. He believed that human beings naturally gravitated toward virtue, harmony, and polite society.
And Swift, sitting in his exile, having watched politicians ruin the country and enrich themselves, clearly thought that was incredibly naive garbage.
Swift uses the Yahoos to present the exact opposite view. He reaches back to an older, darker philosophy. The Yahoos are the living embodiment of Thomas Hobbes' philosophy from his famous 1651 book, Leviathan.
Okay, remind us of the mechanics of Hobbes' theory. How did Hobbes view human nature?
Hobbes famously declared that the state of nature, meaning how human beings would behave without the strict, terrifying rule of a strong government to keep them in check, is a state of perpetual war.
A war of all against all.
Exactly. It is driven by competition, diffidence, and glory. In this natural state, Hobbes wrote, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
So Shaftesbury said our nature is polite and good, but Hobbes said our nature is violent and selfish.
And Swift creates the Yahoos to say, Hobbes was right. Strip away our clothes and our laws, and we are just vicious, greedy apes.
But wait, a Shaftesbury optimist might argue, sure, maybe our bodies are animals, but human beings have reason. We have logic, we have science, we have law. That makes us better than the Yahoos.
How does Swift respond to that defense?
Swift's response is devastating. He argues that our supposed reason doesn't actually make us better or more virtuous. It just makes us vastly more efficient at being Yahoos.
Okay, does he show that? Gulliver has a series of long conversations with his Houyhnhnm master where he tries to defend European society. He tries to explain our systems of law and our glorious military victories, and the horse is just appalled.
Gulliver ends up exposing how horrific we are just by trying to brag about us.
Exactly. To prove how advanced humans are, Gulliver describes European warfare. He details cannons, sieges, bayonets, ships blown into the air, and fields strewn with 1 million dead bodies. And the horse just asks him, why? Why do you do this?
And what is Gulliver's answer? What are these 1 million people actually dying for?
Over the most absurd, trivial disputes imaginable. Gulliver mentions wars fought over religious differences, describing them to the horse as arguments over whether flesh be bread or bread be flesh.
Which is Swift, who is an Anglican clergyman, taking a direct satirical jab at the centuries of bloody warfare between Catholics and Protestants over the doctrine of transubstantiation.
Right, the debate over whether the communion bread literally becomes the body of Christ. And he adds that we fight wars over whether whistling be a vice or a virtue or what color a coat should be.
It's so petty when you frame it like that.
By explaining these devastating continent-spanning wars over microscopic differences in opinion, Gulliver accidentally proves the horse's point. Human reason doesn't make us peaceful. It just takes the Yahoo instinct to throw excrement and upgrades it to the instinct to fire cannons.
Wow.
It multiplies our vices and makes our aggression lethal on a mass scale. Lawyers, politicians, generals to Swift, they are just Yahoos with law degrees and uniforms using their intellect to justify their greed.
This is a brilliant structural trap, because if the Yahoos represent our base, corrupted, instinctual nature, and our reason just makes it worse, then what is the alternative? What does a good society actually look like?
That is the question Swift's structure demands we face, and his answer is the masters of the island, the rational, peaceful horses, the Houyhnhnms.
And if the Yahoos are the nightmare, surely the Houyhnhnms are Swift's utopian ideal for humanity, right? This is where we should all be striving to end up.
Well, you would think so. But this exact question triggers perhaps the biggest, most fiercely contested critical debate in all of Swift scholarship. Are the horses the ideal, or are they just another trap?
Okay, let's look at how their society actually functions before we judge them. What does a Houyhnhnm utopia look like?
The word Houyhnhnm, in their own language, translates to the perfection of nature, and they represent pure, unadulterated rationality. Their society is free from almost every human plague. They have no crime, no poverty, no disease, no lawyers, no politicians.
That's pretty good so far.
They don't even have a word in their language for lying. They have to call it the thing which is not.
Explain the logic behind that. Why don't they have a concept of a lie?
Because to a purely rational mind, the entire biological purpose of speech is to convey truth and share information. Therefore, intentionally saying something that is false contradicts the very function of language. It is literally incomprehensible to them. They cannot process why a creature would choose to say the thing which is not.
They don't have words for opinion or power or war either. They seem utterly perfect. They value friendship, benevolence, and equality. But reading through the source material, there is a massive, glaring catch.
There is a significant, deeply unsettling catch. They have absolutely no passionate emotion. None.
Like zero emotion.
Zero. They have no concept of romantic preference or courtship or even grief. When a Houyhnhnm dies, their friends and family treat it with the exact same emotional weight as if someone were just moving to a different neighborhood to take a new job. There are no tears. There is no mourning.
That's incredibly cold.
Furthermore, they arrange their marriages based strictly on eugenic compatibility, matching coat colors and physical strength to ensure strong offspring. Personal affection plays zero role in who they marry or how they raise their foals.
Wait a second, hold on. A society with arranged eugenic marriages and zero emotional attachment to their children. That doesn't sound like a utopia. That sounds like a dystopian nightmare. This coldness has led many modern critics to argue that Swift is actually satirizing the horses too, hasn't it? That they aren't his ideal at all.
Yes, a major school of thought, often called the soft school of Swift criticism, argues precisely that. They believe the Houyhnhnms are a parody of sterile rationalism. More specifically, they argue Swift is parodying 18th-century deism.
Okay, ELI 5, explain. Like, I'm 5. What is deism and why would Swift hate it so much?
Deism was a rising philosophical and religious belief during the Enlightenment. Deists believed in a perfectly rational clockmaker God. The idea was that God created a perfectly logical universe, wound it up like a clock, and then just stepped back.
So no divine intervention.
Right. Deists rejected divine revelation, miracles, and the messy, emotional, passionate aspects of religion. They believed pure human reason was all you needed to understand morality.
But Swift didn't buy that.
Not at all. Swift, as an orthodox traditional clergyman, believed human beings were fundamentally broken, fallen, in theological terms, and desperately needed divine grace, not just cold logic.
So by creating these hyper-rational, emotionless horses, he's showing the deists what a world run entirely on pure reason actually looks like, and it's sterile.
Exactly. These critics point out that despite their supposed pure reason, the horses are severely, almost comically opinionated. The master horse initially can't even believe Gulliver sailed across the sea in a wooden vessel, simply because he has never seen a wooden vessel.
They are incredibly arrogant in their ignorance. If it doesn't fit their logic, it must be impossible. And it gets much darker than just being arrogant, doesn't it? George Orwell, the author of 1984, famously weighed in on this society. What did Orwell see in the Houyhnhnms?
Orwell read Book 4 and was deeply disturbed by it. He saw terrifying totalitarian and racist undertones in Houyhnhnm society. The horses operate on a rigid, immutable caste system based on coat color.
A caste system?
Yeah, the bay and dapple horses are the masters. The iron gray and black horses are essentially born to be servants. And the most chilling part for Orwell was the Grand Assembly. The Houyhnhnms only hold a Grand Council once every 4 years, and they only ever debate one single topic.
And what is that topic?
Whether to completely exterminate all the Yahoos from the face of the earth.
Oh, wow.
Orwell famously compared this debate over the Yahoo problem to the Nazis and the Holocaust. He saw the Houyhnhnms not as a utopia to be admired, but as a chilling blueprint for a genocidal, emotionless, authoritarian state. For Orwell, pure reason without empathy inevitably leads to the gas chambers.
Wow. That completely shifts the entire axis of the book. It turns it from a quirky satire into a profound warning about the dangers of extreme rationalism. But does everyone agree with Orwell's take? Is it universally accepted that the horses are the bad guys?
Far from it. The hard school of Swift scholarship pushes back aggressively against Orwell's reading. A prominent scholar named Claude Rawson argues that Orwell is applying 20th century historical trauma, the trauma of fascism and the Holocaust, backward onto an 18th century text.
Okay, so how does Rawson defend the horses casually discussing genocide?
Rawson points out that we, the human readers, identify with the Yahoos because we recognize them as biologically human. But to the Houyhnhnms, the Yahoos aren't an oppressed minority group or a citizen class being targeted by the state.
What are they then?
To the horses, the Yahoos are literally just unhygienic, destructive farm pests that kill their cattle and spread disease. Rawson argues that the horses discussing exterminating the Yahoos is really no different than a modern farmer trying to figure out how to deal with a severe rat infestation.
But wait, Rawson has to admit that Swift intentionally made the Yahoos human for a reason? He didn't make them literal rats.
Yes. Rawson fully acknowledges that the dark, agonizing humor of the book relies entirely on the fact that we know the Yahoos are human. Swift includes that detail specifically to deeply offend us. But within the logic of the fantasy world, the horses are just practicing pest control. Other prominent scholars like W.B. Carnation and George Sherburne firmly defend the Houyhnhnms as Swift's genuine, albeit extreme, ideal.
And what's their evidence that Swift actually liked these emotionless horses?
They point to Swift's own private correspondence. Swift wrote a famous letter to his friend Charles Ford while he was working on the book, claiming that humanity is only tolerable at best for want of Houyhnhnms. Swift explicitly stated he wanted to be around these rational creatures.
But I'm going to push back on this. You told me earlier that the horses are completely emotionless. But in the sources, Carnation points out that the horses aren't actually robots, are they? If they are perfectly emotionless, how do we explain their reactions to Gulliver?
That is a very sharp observation, and it's exactly what Carnation uses to defend them. The text actually contradicts the idea that they are pure, unfeeling calculators.
Where do we see that?
When the master horse hears Gulliver describe European vices and wars, Swift writes that the horse shows noble resentment. Resentment is an emotion. And later, when the Houyhnhnm assembly forces the master to expel Gulliver from the island, Gulliver notes that his master is in some perplexity, meaning he is troubled by it.
Oh, so he doesn't want him to leave.
Right. And the horse stands on the shore, watching Gulliver sail away until he is completely out of sight. That lingering gaze suggests a level of care, attachment, and sadness that goes far beyond pure, cold logic.
So they do have feelings, they're just governed by reason rather than overwhelmed by passion like we are. If we step back and look at the philosophical game Swift is playing with the horses and the humans, he's actually doing a massive inversion of a major scientific theory of his time, isn't he?
Yes, he is directly flipping René Descartes' famous animal machine theory.
Okay, explain the mechanics of Descartes' theory. Why did Descartes think animals were machines?
Descartes, writing in the 17th century, argued that the defining characteristic of a divine rational soul was language and complex thought. Because animals don't possess complex language, Descartes concluded they lack reason entirely.
So what did he think they were?
He argued that animals are essentially just biological automatons, flesh and blood machines, driven purely by mechanical instinct. Humans, however, possess the divine spark of rationality.
And Swift takes that exact logic and completely inverts it.
He turns it completely upside down. He takes language, reason, and philosophy and gives it entirely to the horses. And he strips it completely from the humans, leaving the Yahoos as the biological automatons driven by pure mechanical instinct.
It's a total devastating rejection of the classical definition of man.
Swift fundamentally believed that the classical definition of man as animal rationale, meaning we are inherently and naturally a rational animal, was a dangerous lie. He believed that man is only rationis capax, meaning we are merely capable of reason. The capacity is there, but we rarely, if ever, actually use it.
I want to address you, the listener, directly for a second. Think about the agonizing dilemma Swift has placed at the center of this book. On one hand, you have the Yahoos, passionate, emotional, but driven by greed, violence, and filth. On the other hand, you have the Houyhnhnms, perfectly peaceful, rational, and free from disease, but devoid of deep romantic attachment, passionate love, or grief. Would you actually want to live in a world with no passionate love just so you could have a world with no war? Is perfect peace worth the absolute cost of our messy, emotional humanity?
That is the philosophical trap. And caught directly in the jaws of that trap, sandwiched between these feral Yahoos and the unfeeling Houyhnhnms, is Lemuel Gulliver himself.
So, what actually happens to a man's mind when he is forced to see his own species as monsters and falls madly in love with an ideal of perfection he can never, ever achieve?
It breaks him, utterly and completely. Gulliver undergoes a devastating psychological collapse. He goes from being a proud Englishman, eager to defend his country's honor, to becoming a thoroughly disillusioned, self-loathing misanthrope.
How bad does it get?
He adores the horses so much and hates his own human biology so much that he actively tries to become a horse. He mimics their trotting gait when he walks. He adopts the tone and whinny of a horse's voice when he speaks.
He hates his own humanity so much, he's essentially cosplaying as a horse. But it doesn't save him, does it? A Houyhnhnm assembly votes to expel him. Why? If he's behaving so well, why kick him out?
Because of the cold, unfeeling logic of their society. They recognize that Gulliver has a glimmer of reason, but he is biologically a Yahoo. They fear that this combination is dangerous.
So he's a threat.
Yes. They calculate that a rational Yahoo might one day organize the feral Yahoos and lead a rebellion against the horses. It is a purely preemptive, logical decision.
When Gulliver receives this decree, how does he react?
He's completely devastated. He swoons at his master's feet in despair. He's being cast out of the only paradise he has ever known, not because of anything he did wrong, but precisely because of the biology he was born with and cannot change.
So he builds a canoe and sails away, fully intending to live alone on a desolate rock rather than ever return to human society. But he is found, and he is rescued completely against his will by a Portuguese ship.
Right, captained by Don Pedro de Mendes.
Yes, Don Pedro de Mendes. Now, structurally, this is a vital character. Why is Don Pedro so important to the narrative?
Don Pedro is the ultimate test for Gulliver's new worldview. Swift goes out of his way to portray Don Pedro not as a corrupt politician or a greedy Yahoo, but as the absolute best of humanity.
He's a genuinely good guy.
Yes. Don Pedro treats the raving, hostile Gulliver with extreme hospitality, immense patience, generosity, and true kindness. He gives Gulliver his own clothes, feeds him, and listens to his crazy stories without judging him.
And how does Gulliver, our enlightened, rational protagonist, react to this incredibly good, decent human being?
With absolute visceral disgust. Gulliver views this remarkably good man with horror simply because Don Pedro is biologically human, and therefore, in Gulliver's damaged mind, just another Yahoo.
He can't even see the good in front of him.
Exactly. Gulliver cannot see the individual virtue standing right in front of him because he is so completely blinded by his absolute hatred for the species as a whole.
And this psychological damage reaches its peak when he finally gets back to England. He returns to his own home, to his wife and children, after being away for 5 years. Explain this scene to me, because it is one of the most heartbreaking, chilling endings in literature.
It is incredibly vivid. Gulliver walks through his front door. His wife, who likely thought he was dead, comes up to welcome him with joy and kisses him. And Gulliver, the man she loves, faints in absolute, revulsed horror at having his face touched by what he calls an odious animal.
He literally passes out from the disgust of his wife's kiss.
Yes, and he cannot stand the smell of human beings. He stuffs his nose with tobacco and rue just to tolerate sitting in the same room as his family.
What does he do instead of being with his family?
Ultimately, he buys 2 young horses and spends 4 hours every single day conversing with them in the stable. He even buys a mirror to look at himself, trying to slowly, painfully habituate himself to tolerate the mere sight of a human creature without vomiting.
Okay, so what does this all mean? Is this just a bleak, tragic ending where everyone loses? Or is Swift doing something vastly more complex with Gulliver's madness?
This is where we encounter the literary concept of the satirist satirized. Swift is making an elaborate, incredibly subtle, and painful joke at his own expense.
Explain that. How is the joke on Swift?
Think about Gulliver's flaw here. Gulliver has become so blinded by his hatred of human pride, the arrogance of the Yahoos, that his own pride in pretending to be a horse and looking down his nose at a genuinely good man like Don Pedro becomes deeply comical and, frankly, pathetic.
So Swift is satirizing the very act of being a misanthrope. He's making fun of the guy who hates humanity.
Yes. Our sources compare Gulliver's trajectory to Shakespeare's character Timon of Athens, who also becomes a famous legendary misanthrope. But there is a crucial difference in the mechanics of their hatred.
What's the difference?
Timon revels in his hatred of humanity. He embraces it. Gulliver's misanthropy, on the other hand, is agonizingly painful to him. He doesn't want to be isolated. He actively tries to habituate himself to his family using the mirror. He wants to be able to sit in a room with his weeping wife. His isolation is entirely tragic, not triumphant.
It's like Swift is using Gulliver as a mirror for himself, warning us against the very satire he is currently writing. He's asking, if you stare too long into the abyss of human flaw, do you just end up living in a barn, alienated from everyone who actually loves you?
It is a profound, almost confessionary self-reflection from Swift. If we look at Swift's own letters from this period, we see this exact painful tension playing out in real time. He wrote a famous letter to his close friend, the poet Alexander Pope.
What did he say to Pope?
In it, Swift declared that he hated that animal called man, but he heartily loved individuals like John, Peter, and Thomas.
He hates the crowd but loves the person. He hates the concept of humanity but loves his friends.
Exactly. Yet, Swift was constantly haunted by his own anger. He referred to it as his ill-governed zeal. He knew his rage at human corruption, at Walpole, at the South Sea Bubble, was destroying his own peace of mind.
It was eating him alive.
One of his friends actually asked him if the corruptions of men didn't eat his flesh and exhaust his spirits. Swift was deeply aware that his satiric vision, his ability to see the Yahoo in everyone, was a heavy, personal curse.
Okay, zooming out from this tragic, lonely scene of a man talking to horses in a stable, we really need to look at the massive structural architecture of the entire book to understand why Swift designed it to end this way. It's not just a random sequence of wacky adventures that happens to end sadly. There's a deep geometry to this book, isn't there?
There is an incredibly precise structure. The scholar Robert P. Fitzgerald provides a brilliant structural analysis of the 4 voyages that make up the whole of Gulliver's travels. He outlines a dual problem that drives the mechanics of the entire narrative: the equivocal value of society versus the equivocal value of knowledge.
Okay, let's treat this like an intellectual puzzle. Break those 2 concepts down for us.
Throughout the 4 books, Swift is essentially stress testing 2 questions. How do we adapt to living in a society? And what is the actual practical value of the knowledge we acquire?
Right.
In part 1, which is the famous Voyage to Lilliput, and part 2, the Voyage to Brobdingnag, Gulliver is dealing primarily with physical differences in relatively realistic, recognizable political worlds.
Right. In Lilliput, he is a massive giant among tiny, petty politicians.
And how does that physical greatness serve him? It ultimately gets him rejected. He is too big, too powerful. The society turns on him out of political jealousy and literally schemes to blind him.
And then Brobdingnag is the reverse.
Exactly. In Brobdingnag, the land of the giants, the physical situation is entirely reversed. He is tiny, small, and physically insignificant. And despite the fact that the giant king of Brobdingnag is actually a wise, good ruler, Gulliver cannot be taken seriously. He is treated as a cute, dangerous little toy.
So in both cases, his body is the problem.
In both of those first 2 cases, physical difference makes a permanent, harmonious adaptation to society impossible.
But then we shift gears completely for the second half of the book.
Exactly. Part 3, the Voyage to Laputa, and Part 4, the Houyhnhnms, shift away from physical differences and focus entirely on mental differences. Gulliver's body is normal size now, but he is in extreme, highly fantastical worlds of the mind.
Now, what's fascinating here is how Gulliver acts in Part 3 compared to how he acts in Part 4, because he treats the flying island very differently than he treats the horses.
This is the absolute crux of Fitzgerald's structural point.
Yeah.
Think about the brilliant game Swift is playing with us. In Part 3, The Flying Island, the Academy of Legato Gulliver is just a tourist.
He's just passing through.
Right. He is observing bad knowledge. He sees obsessive, destructive theorizing and absurd scientific experiments that parody the real-world royal society. But crucially, he never tries to become a Laputan. He doesn't want to live on the flying island. He just watches, judges their foolishness, and leaves.
And because he stays detached, he stays sane.
Because he remains just an observer, his core character and his sanity are protected.
But in part 4, with the horses, his approach is entirely different. He doesn't just want to observe the Houyhnhnms, he desperately, entirely wants to join their society. He fully adopts their knowledge as his own absolute truth.
And that is the devastating structural conclusion of the entire masterpiece. In the first 2 books, physical differences are the curse that isolates him. But in the 4th book, his body isn't the problem. Knowledge itself is the curse.
Wow. By finding what he believes to be the perfect rational society and gaining the perfect unvarnished knowledge of human depravity, he completely ruins himself.
Precisely. Finding the ultimate ideal makes it permanently, psychologically impossible for Gulliver to ever again live in the real, imperfect human world. His absolute knowledge of our Yahoo nature destroys his ability to exist within human society.
Think about how that applies to us. We all have to live in a society, and we all naturally seek truth and knowledge, but Swift is structurally proving that the more you know about the deep, systemic flaws of society, the harder it is to just exist within it.
It's a heavy burden.
Have you ever learned something about how the world works? Maybe a hard political truth, or a dark fact about human psychology, or how a specific industry operates that you genuinely wish you could unlearn, just so you could go back to being happy and blissfully ignorant? That is the exact tragic trap Gulliver falls into.
It is the ultimate tragedy of the intellectual pursuit. Swift is warning us. If you demand perfection and absolute, uncompromising rationality from a deeply flawed world, you won't fix the world. You will only end up alienating yourself from the very people you have to share that world with.
What an incredible, devastating journey. Let's recap what we've unpacked today. We started in the absolute political ruins of Jonathan Swift's career, watching a powerful, brilliant man exiled to Ireland while his rivals enriched themselves through the corruption of the South Sea bubble.
Right.
We saw how he ingeniously weaponized the popular travelogue genre to launch a stealth, defamiliarizing attack on European colonialism, Walpole's government, and human greed. We waded deep into the fierce philosophical wrestling match between the base, instinctual Hobbesian Yahoos and the cold, Cartesian perfection of the Houyhnhnms.
A truly epic clash of ideas.
And ultimately, we watched the deeply moving, tragic, isolated end of Lemuel Gulliver, a man whose pursuit of perfect, unyielding rationality destroyed his ability to love his own family.
It leaves us in a deeply uncomfortable place, which is exactly where Swift, the master satirist, wanted us. We spend our lives striving for total rationality. We try to eliminate our biases, we try to suppress our messy emotions, and we try to rise above our tribal conflicts. We all want to believe we are Houyhnhnms.
We really do.
But Swift leaves us with a haunting, lingering question to mull over. If we actually succeeded in becoming perfectly rational creatures, completely devoid of irrational passions, would we lose the very empathy, art, and love that make the human experience worth enduring in the first place? If the price of a perfectly peaceful utopia is becoming unfeeling, calculating horses, are we perhaps better off embracing our inner, deeply flawed Yahoo and just trying to be a little bit kinder to each other?
Just remember that the next time you feel the urge to look down on the rest of humanity from your high horse, you might just end up living in the stable. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We invite you to take what you've learned today, look a little closer at the world around you, and maybe navigate this wonderfully imperfect Yahoo world with just a little more grace.